Welcome to the No-Till Training Program's 8-part webinar series. This training has been developed through a collaboration between the University of Vermont, University of Maine, and USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. All associated work and materials are supported by the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, U.S. Department of Agriculture, through the Northeast Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, under subaward ENE 18-149. This webinar will focus on economics of no-till with a presentation by Kirsten Workman accompanied by George Foster. Kirsten Workman is an agronomy outreach specialist with University of Vermont Extension, working out of the Middlebury Extension office as a member of the Champlain Valley Crop, Soil, and Pasture team.
As Catherine said, I'm Kirsten. I work for UVM Extension here in the Middlebury office, and I'm glad to be joined by producer George Foster from Foster Brothers Farms, who you'll hear from shortly today. So I'm going to try and keep my comments to about 30 minutes so we can hear from George, and then I encourage you all to ask him lots of questions while we have him here. Okay, so when I talk about conservation agronomy, and conservation agriculture is really a term that's been floated around a lot lately, and I'm going to say this a lot today, but it's my tenet and my thought that really just good basic agronomy is conservation agronomy. So a lot of the practices and things that we've been talking about as a part of this series of webinars, as well as what we've been talking about for the last several years now here in the Northeast with soil health and conservation, is all very much related. And so hopefully I'll share why that is. But the basic tenets are sort of the same. We want to reduce our inputs and the cost of those inputs. We hopefully can maximize yields. Efficiency always wins. And I think we all know that losses hurt the farm as much as they hurt the environment. So I pulled this quote from one of the resources that I have linked to the class website. And this is a farmer out of Kansas, a grain grower, that says that conservation agriculture isn't just, not tilling or planting cover crops. It's a complete systems change. That systems change requires a mindset change that embraces the benefits of diversity and building resiliency over time. And what I really like about that is that idea of building resiliency, which I'm going to hit on quite a bit here, and the value of that, even though it's hard to quantify, and the fact that it does take time, right? It's not overnight. So the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations kind of takes conservation agriculture, is what they call it, and breaks into 3 areas. And these are pretty basic. I think obviously we can get into much more detail than that, but I feel like the economic and agronomic things on this list really work in concert with each other. And again, I think that goes back to that idea that just good basic agronomy is conservation agronomy. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we, quantifying time and labor reductions, cost reductions, and improving efficiency. I think George will have lots of information to share with you on that end. And then I'm going to try to tie some economic benefits to the organic matter infiltration and sort of soil structure benefits we see as a result of these practices and systems. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time trying to talk about why to do these things in terms of like, why do we want to do conservation agronomy? I think we've been talking about that all along. And so if you have specific questions about that, please ask, but I'm going to try and focus on those first 2. And again, I want to hit home that this is a system, and that, it's not just one practice that a farmer picks up, although that's often where we start. But really what I find lately these days is that we're farming what I call it the nexus of soil health. And what the benefit to that I find too is not only are we seeing that we're seeing improved soil health, we're seeing improved water quality, hopefully in the future, we're producing a good product, but I think also by contributing to our the health of our communities, that one of the things that we can't really quantify is the idea about having our neighbors understand what we're doing, be supportive of what we're doing, and see those changes on the ground. And I think we're starting to see that tide turn a little bit, where instead of just getting complaints from our neighbors, hopefully we're getting some positive attention from the good work that farmers are doing too. Okay, so I'm going to start with the easy stuff. Converting to no-till, if you just crunch the numbers on just no-till, so stopping tilling and planting using no-till methods, pretty much is a no-brainer financially if you can keep your yields high. It pencils out. So Rick Kersbergen, who you guys will hear from the next webinar, I believe, is our facilitator. Did a great study, and the final report is linked in your resources from 2012, and he surveyed producers in the Northeast, and essentially at the end of the day, those producers reported seeing about $50 an acre in savings. So about half of that came in their fuel reductions, and the other half of that came in their labor savings, and they did not see significant differences in corn and silage yields. And I think that's what we've seen over time here, even since 2012, is that if you do it well and you adopt a system, we can keep and maintain our yields high, hopefully improve them over time, not see that big yield drag that everyone talks about. I think because we're in manured systems by and large here in the Northeast, we're not limited by moisture. We don't, and we've seen people adopting no-till and cover cropping together instead of just starting with no-till. And they also have been wise about adopting no-till carefully. So not just being in continuous tillage and continuous corn, and then all of a sudden one day you stop tilling and you plant your corn in the same field. I don't think we've seen that as much here. And so we don't see the yield drag. So those are true savings at the end of the day. And so some of the things you can't necessarily put a number on always, because we don't really measure it annually this way, is compaction. I feel like one of the huge benefits we're seeing from these systems, and in no-till in particular, is a reduction in compaction. So University of Minnesota has a great article that is also linked in this presentation. But basically, Jody talks about the idea of one compacting event. So driving through your field and creating soil compaction once can actually give you yield losses over, a dozen or more years, a dozen or more year growing seasons in your field. So that's significant. We've heard from other folks that like you do 75% of your total possible compaction damage the first pass over a field if you're going to compact it. And we know that especially in some of our silage systems and manure systems and hay systems, we're doing that multiple times, not just once. And we're kind of control traffic is difficult in these situations, and so we end up driving over essentially the entire field. And there are numbers, I think it can be this severe. I don't think it is always, but we can see up to 60% reduction in yields. And what we know is that improving soil structure is really the best defense against soil compaction. And we're going to see some pictures from that, and I think George can speak to that later as well. But basically, a well-structured soil really holds water. It conducts water where it needs to be, so it doesn't get saturated. It also can improve your nutrient cycling and provide that pore space for air for healthy plant roots that can go deeply and be resistant to drought later in the season also. And we can just see from the picture there sort of how that happens and then what that looks like in the field. And I think we've probably all seen yield losses from compaction in one way or the other. Another sort of, this picture is actually from George's farm. We were just trying to remember, I think it's from around 2013. And George was just starting to adopt no-till practices. So these two fields are really side by side. There's a ditch separating them, but other than that, they were the same. And in this particular year, one of the fields had been sod and he planted no-till corn into it. And the other field, I think, had been corn before. And he did conventional tillage and planted the corn pretty much at the same time. And this was a year where we had like a 3 or 4 week drought, and then we got a big rainstorm. And what you can see there, looking at this picture, is on the left, that tilled field. It's kind of hard to tell from the picture, but there's water on the surface, sort of ponding, and the beginnings of erosion where that soil starts to get dissolved in the water that's not infiltrating on the field and running off. These are both Vergennes clay soils, same soil type. You can see mud on my boot there on the left, and then literally the next field over that had good soil structure to start with from all that perennial hay roots, and then a no-till cornfield, no mud, no water on the surface, good infiltration. And if you look closely, it's hard to tell from the picture, but I promise from being out in those two fields that the field on the left had already started to experience some drought stress. You can see it looks like it's maybe nutrient stress, where the field on the right basically didn't miss a beat. And when we did get that water, it infiltrated and the crop just was able to use it immediately. The field on the left, the crop was having issues already with moisture and nutrients. And then we can see that even though we finally got some rain, it's not really soaking in. And over time, that soil structure is really driving those processes. So here's just another example from Foster Brothers. I don't think it was the same year, it might have been a different year, but again, at the beginning of their no-till transition, they enrolled in a BMP challenge program where they enrolled a field, and they did no-till on most of it, but we had to leave a check strip of conventional tillage, and then they grew their corn, and then our job was to come out and measure yield. So the day they were harvesting, we came out and measured yields, and it was a rough year. It was a wet year, you can tell from the corn, but the chopper there's in the field on the no-till side harvesting, really not leaving any ruts, and had a pretty hard time on the strip that had been tilled. The chopper was working pretty hard to make it out and not get stuck, and you can see the kind of compaction that we caused there just in that strip. And in a similar field just around the corner from here, we saw similar things from the summer. It was a very wet year, and where the spray rig had gone in to either do side dress or herbicide application, in that check strip where there was tillage, there was quite a serious set of ruts where the no-till side did not have that. Okay, so no-till, I think, pretty straightforward. The benefits are real financially. When we get into cover crops, it gets, I say, a little more complicated, but I think it's probably a lot more complicated. So one of the things is that planting, getting a cover crop established costs money. And in Rick's study, they talked about $30 an acre to plant it. I'm going to show you a little bit more. And a little bit more recent numbers, because we take into account also how you plant it and what your seeding rate is. But then we also have to take into account the cost of termination, and those can be quite variable depending on what you do and what your current system is. It may be less expensive or more expensive depending on what you're currently doing now. So then the question is, well, yes, it costs money to do. Are there any savings as a result? So I think there can be, yes, for sure. And I'm just going to take your attention down that statement at the bottom, which is really what we've been struggling with, which is how do you quantify something that just sort of makes the system work, or at least makes the system work better. So while we might not realize any real cost savings per se that we can quantify in our crop enterprise budget, I think there are benefits there that are just making the system work better for us here in the Northeast, and that's hard to see. So if you look up above at that little graph, that's from the NRCS has this cover crop tool, which is, it's actually quite complex. I think as a service provider, it might be really valuable to sort of walk through with one or two of your producers and see if it's a valuable tool for you to use, or maybe even run some scenarios. But essentially, I don't know if you can see my arrow, if I can get it moving here, that we don't see any net gain from the cover crop until like year 10. So it's basically another additional cost perhaps on our farm until after about 10 years, when we start to see things like soil organic matter go up, water infiltration go up as a result of that continued addition of organic matter and living plant roots and all the other things that it provides. Now, if you do other things with your cover crops, which I mentioned here, like if you harvest or graze them, keep your own seed for future years use, then we start to see some additional income in terms of dollars and cents that actually can then offset the cost of establishing that. So we'll take a little bit of a look at that. One of the things is I think we've learned over time is how you plant your cover crop can be really important on what the value is you get back out of it. So this is just an example that, and I'll show you some more about broadcasting versus drilling. So what it's showing here is that if we plant a winter rye single species cover crop to NRCS specifications and we broadcast it or you aerially seed it, you're required to plant 112 pounds. And the reason is that you don't get as good of establishment. So that's why they require a higher rate. So that if you take into account the 112 pound seed cost, which is here at $39.20, plus the cost of establishment, you end up in the $53 to $66 per acre. And then if you actually incorporate it, they say, oh, you can get away with a lower seeding rate, which bears out in real life. I would argue we can go even lower, which I'll show you in a minute. But if you do 75 pounds of winter rye and you broadcast it with some sort of incorporation, your seed costs go down, but actually your establishment goes up because you end up taking a couple passes over the field. But if you use a no-till drill, you get in at $47, $48 per acre to get that cover crop established. and in actuality, you get a much better stand. And so I'm going to show you some pictures of that. So as you get into other species, that may or may not be true depending on seed cost. So tillage radish, it's kind of a wash whether you broadcast or drill it in terms of total cost. But I will tell you again that within $1, less than $1, or a little over $1 difference from each other, you're going to get a much better result from this aerial or this drilled radish crop, and then the same when you get into these mixtures. So here's just an example. Again, I wanted to use George's farm. So you guys are gonna be able to go out and see these fields, but we went out and planted a couple fields at George's farm, and one of them we planted 75 pounds of winter rye with our no-till drill, and we were able to plant that on September 13th, and I went out and took pictures on October 25th and used this Canopio app to estimate percent cover. So it switches everything that's green to white and everything else goes black. So it's not counting any residue from the corn crop, but you can see that we established by the end of October a 69% soil coverage from that cover crop. And where George had gone on the field right next to it and had broadcast the seed and then gone through with his mulcher to incorporate the seed into the ground, around the same time, just a couple days later, but the pictures were taken the same day, we get 30% cover. So not bad, but obviously we're getting double or more the soil coverage and the benefit. And in the spring, if you were going to be harvesting that crop, you'd be much happier. And again, I'm going to show you just a couple other pictures. This is from some work I've done in the last few years where we took the same treatments of cover crop and we drilled them here on the left, and then we broadcast the same treatments here on the right. And you can just see that you get this very spotty, uneven establishment when we broadcast. These were hit also with about 4,000 gallons of manure over the surface to try and help with that. But again, drilling just in the end gives us a much more uniform stand, better establishment for the same amount of seed. And then this is what those same exact plots look like in the spring, just for reference. And then what we see is in the same study, basically what I'm circling here is that all the way down to this is 60 pounds of winter rye, gave us the same results as 112 pounds on almost every site year, both in the fall and the spring. So there was no difference between this 112 pounds and the 60 pounds when it came to biomass. And in the fall, our broadcast plots, what was interesting, those same treatments that were just broadcast on the surface with no incorporation other than manure being applied were no different statistically than having no cover crop at all when it came to biomass, and the same came true for percent cover. So basically, broadcasting 112 pounds in most years was no different than nothing, which is like, oh, that's an expensive venture. So then also looking at things like harvesting our cover crops for forage, we have many farmers that are doing that, or at least trying it and evaluating it. One of the opportunity costs is like, well, if I wait to harvest my cover crop to plant my corn, am I going to lose yield? And you can see there's visually not a whole lot of difference here on waiting. So you can see they had already plowed under the piece here that and planted before they came in here and harvested the cover crop and came back and planted, and we didn't see a huge yield difference on the corn crop. They did get about 5 tons of silage equivalent rye that was being fed to cows at, it wasn't awesome. I've seen higher protein, average about 16% protein feed at a relative feed value of 102. And then of course, what we're not valuing either is if we were to leave that in the field, there's lots of nutrients potentially available, although again, that can be tricky. So cover crops are complex for sure. And I think overall, the thing here is sometimes the benefits we get are actually what I call opportunity savings. So we think about opportunity costs of a lot of our decisions, but I think these systems, as we see our producers adopt them, that in these, especially these years where we're getting fewer and fewer normal years and more years where it's either a wet year or a dry year. And I feel like that's where these systems are starting to shine here in the Northeast and can be often the linchpin. So in 2017, we had a very wet spring, and there was one particular producer. They're a large dairy farm here with heavy clay soils, and they were just starting to try some no-till. And so the fall before, they had about a third of their cornfields ready to be no-tilled. The rest were fall plowed and going to be normal conventional tillage in the spring. And that spring, the only cornfields that they got planted on their farm were their no-till fields. That was about a third of their corn ground. Everything else was a prevented planting. So that was huge. And I think it made them think really closely about the potential of doing more of that in the future. It can often, as I showed, can make the difference about whether you can get in and harvest a particular crop when you have good soil structure. One of the big benefits that I've heard many producers talk about is the idea of rotation, and how easy it is to say, get something planted, or if, decide whether a field needs to be in corn or hay or soybeans. It really takes away some of the complexities of the planting part of that equation. And so it's just much less stressful to say, oh, for whatever reason, I'm going to seed that field down even though I wasn't planning on doing it this year. Knowing that you don't have to do different tillage based on, necessarily what you're planting. So those opportunity savings are good. And then really looking at things like if you have HEL ground, if you're in limitations from a phosphorus index because of erosion, or your nutrient management plan is limiting you based on erosion, and we can get these systems adopted, it really can reduce a lot of that pressure on a farm as well, about where we can put manure and when, where we can put corn and how long we can keep it in our rotation. We have less sort of regulatory restrictions. And then that idea of we're building resiliency, and really what I think about is predictability, which is hard to also kind of put a value on, and I'll show you what I'm talking about in a couple slides on that. There are some folks, so NRCS obviously has been a big proponent of soil health systems and conservation agriculture, and they've been putting a lot of money towards that. And they are trying also to assign some value to these systems. And you can see that, infiltration is huge. That's one of the things that's hard to really put a monetary value on, but we do know that here we see a no-till system really having, impressive amounts of infiltration compared to moldboard plow, chisel plow, other forms of tillage that we know are reducing our ability to infiltrate water. And as we get our water events further and further apart and more intense, it's important to capture that water and hang on to it for later in the season. This chart here does try and quantify that. So they call that water holding capacity, which is this blue portion of the chart, and then our available nitrogen and phosphorus. And so depending on how much you improve your soil organic matter, they're saying you can start to improve the value of your soil, we jump from 2% where we're kind of at like 30%, $30 per acre value, all the way up to, doubling that if we get to 1% more of soil organic matter. And we see this in the field. So many of you, as I'm sure have seen the rainfall simulator, this idea of infiltration is super important. So these are 3 soils, all the same soil type with hay, no-till corn that had a cover crop before it, and a conventionally tilled cornfield. And many people focus on this runoff, which we should, because obviously there's a lot of runoff with sediment attached to it in the system. But what I'm looking at is that empty bucket in the back with no infiltration. And we all know that if we've had 3 weeks of a drought and we get a 1-inch rainstorm, which this is simulated, we want every bit of that rain to enter our soil profile and be available for our crop. And if it's all running off the surface, we can't get it back. Where here we're able to infiltrate it, store it, and then of course we see reduced runoff and erosion. And then in our hay fields is where we're sort of aiming to emulate even in our annually cropped systems. And this is this idea. So the purple line is sort of like goal, like as we get flashiness out of our system by building soil structure, when we have those really wet years, which we see here, though this is rainfall, if we have a high rainfall summer, we tend to see lower yields. If we have a pretty normal year in rainfall, we might end up with pretty good yields. We might have some highs that are higher, but we definitely are going to have some lows that are lower. And I don't know about you, but I'd rather plan for this every year instead of guessing which year I'm going to get based on the weather. And that's basically, one of the things that we're trying to really focus on with these systems. And it's really hard to quantify the value of getting good yields consistently and not having like super fantastic yields and really awful yields from year to year. And so we are starting to see this in our farms. This is another farm here in Addison County on clay. And those of you that know Virgins B clay, this is good soil health in Virgins B clay. But we do have producers just trying to like figure out the system, and do I still need to subsoil? Do I not? And, you know, trying to figure that out. And I think what we're finding is, like, we were in this pit in the middle of a cornfield in the summer, and we were seeing rooting depths all the way down to the tile drain, you know, 3 and 4 feet deep in the soil surface. And I think that's really what we're aiming for. So, you know, like I said, it's not a straightforward sort of crop enterprise budget. We can't just plug and play like what our seed costs are, what our herbicide costs are, what our harvest costs are. It doesn't always pencil out like that. So we have to kind of think of it as sort of, what are our short-term returns versus our long-term returns? What are the returns on those investments that we're making? When can we make those investments, and how long? So we kind of got to break it up into sort of this season, this year questions, all the way forward to like this decade and this generation and beyond. And I just want to bring your attention to this down below, this publication, which I've also linked in our materials, is what we see overall, and I think I agree with this, is that when we adopt conservation practices on our farm as a system, overall, we tend to see fuel use and costs go down, labor use and costs go down, and equipment overall go down, although you may have some upfront investment in new equipment. Overall, you'll have lower equipment costs. We may see fertilizer costs first go up. We see this a lot in our corn silage and cover crop no-till systems. Like, we might need to actually invest in a little extra fertility in the beginning until we start to see the returns of that soil organic matter, soil structure, giving that fertility back to us. So it might go up first and then go down overall. Herbicide tends to be kind of a wash. If you're already using herbicide in your system for weed control, it might be that it's just a different approach and not necessarily an increased amount of product. Or an increase of cost, although it can be, depending. And then, of course, we're spending more money on seed in cover crops, for sure. But I do want to just say that a few other pieces when we think about the financial stuff is, you know, we can't manage what we don't know. So record keeping is going to be super important. And I've seen presentations where they're now with precision ag, which we learned about from Scott last time. You know, we have this ability to sort of analyze every acre and what the return on investment is for each acre. And when we do that, we can really zero in on the parts of our farm that can be more profitable in the future under these systems. And then do we maybe phase out those acres that aren't going to be profitable anyway? And the other piece is, a lot of this has been driven heretofore as, you know, regulatory, reducing erosion, water quality rules. Here in Vermont, we're all very aware of the new regulations that face us every day. And I'm always trying to work with my producers on turning those regulatory instruments that we're required to do, our nutrient management plan, meeting T, and let's instead, you know, the phosphorus index, let's turn those into management tools to make decisions. Because as I said, if we're reducing erosion, we're reducing phosphorus loss, we're doing better at managing our nutrients, that should pencil out for the farm. And so, you know, let's do that. And if we have the record keeping requirements anyway, let's use those to make decisions on our farm. And I have seen that as folks, let's say, do a better job tracking yields because they're required to for their nutrient management plan. They start to understand, oh, wait, you know, my whole farm doesn't average this. Really, I need to look at it on a field by field basis. And maybe over time, I do have higher yields than I think I do. Or maybe I really am applying less manure than I think I am. And it can work in the farm's benefit as much as be just a pain to do. And then, of course, every case is going to be different. It's a whole different system. It's a whole different mentality. One of the farmers I work with actually in New York said that he felt like all the no-till farmers should get mandatory and paid vacations in July so they could leave and not see their fields until they've gone through that kind of ugly phase and then turn out okay and look just as good or better than their neighbor farm. And then again, we just need to, you know, do a better job of writing it down. I think especially in the Northeast, working to do a better job of quantifying that. So I have a grant right now, which we're going to be kicking into high gear to try and quantify that better here for us. And the piece that I did miss, I was going to stick in here, is also there's a lot of cost sharing grants available that help make this, you know, even better for us here. And we should take advantage of those and help our producers take advantage of those while they're here for sure. So back to my lecture about basic agronomy is good agronomy. I'm saying this again because you all as technical service providers, I think this is one of the most important ways you can add value to your producer's operations. Every time that we stop and take a minute to calibrate a piece of equipment, to measure something, a yield, a nutrient application, to scout a field, to go take a soil test or scout for pests, and write things down, it always turns out better. And I feel like just take the little details are important. It's always worth the time that it takes. So many times, no-till and cover cropping get tried as a practice, and they get put out in the back 40 or the really crappy field, or, you know, oh, I could get out there and plant, so I did. And no-till and cover cropping become the scapegoat for a bad crop, when often it's sort of shortcuts or situations that we weren't paying attention to the details that could have made the difference. And it really wasn't the no-till or the cover crop that was the problem. It was some of those other underlying issues. So record keeping is always the perennial problem. And I always say to my farmers in nutrient management planning class, like, what's the right record keeping system? It's the one that you're going to use. So if it's the notebook in your back pocket, a piece of paper in the tractor, precision ag monitor, you know, that records every bit of information, you know, the handbook the state hands out, notes in your phone, whatever it is, if it's the thing you will use, that's the one you want to use. And then we can get that in whatever form we need to moving forward to use that information, for sure. And then, you know, just the idea that at the end of the day, that we have to remember that financials are part of the sustainability equation, right? So sustainability isn't just about the planet, but it's also about the people who are farming and keeping them in the business, and they have to make a profit as well. And I like this picture. This was from 2017. It was a super wet year, and this is one of our farms in Addison County who had to make the bunk just a little bit bigger for all the corn silage to fit in, because after multiple years of installing tile drainage, reducing tillage, adding cover crops, they had one of the best crops ever, because they were able to deal with excess moisture and really do a good job. So they were pretty happy with how things were going. All right, so I'm going to transition here just a little bit real quick and introduce George Foster. So George and his son Jeremy do the cropping enterprises at Foster Brother Farms Incorporated here in Middlebury, Vermont. He's going to share with you a little bit more about their farm, but I will say that George has been an important partner for us here in the Middlebury Extension Office. He lets us try all sorts of crazy, wacky things, like this field at the bottom that had like 22 strips of all sorts of different cover crops, including this was, I think, buckwheat, radishes, legumes, everything right on the main road. And then lets us plant corn on it and see if it grows. And then also has been host to many a bus tour, workshop, field day. He sat on farmer panels, again, as he's doing here today for you. He's been super open and willing to share what their farm has done and what's worked and what hasn't. So we appreciate him being here. He's going to share a little bit more about his farm. And then I do also have some pictures of stuff they're doing. So if we have questions, I can kind of switch to those.
Yes, we've been no-tilling since 2012. That's when we started this adventure. What's turned us on to no-tilling was because I attended a conference, the no-till conference at UVM, and the stuff that was presented seemed like a possibility for our place. We did no-tilling probably in excess of 20 years ago, but back then we didn't do cover crops, and so we didn't have the success that we're having now. We have purchased a 12-row no-till Kinsey planter in 2012. At that time, we were doing 350 acres of corn, a little soybeans, and that was the extent of it. Now we're up to 500 acres of corn, 300 acres of beans. We grow 100 acres of grain because we grow our own cover crop, which is generally either rye or wheat. We operate 1,600 acres of tillable land. Upon going with the no-till corn planter, some of the things we looked at that we didn't know at the time was we just ordered the planter according to what the machinery dealer said to get. It didn't take us long to find out that we ordered a lot of parts we didn't need. One, we didn't need coulters. We didn't have downforce, so we then invested and put in the ag leader downforce with row shutoffs. We changed the closing wheels from a cast iron solid wheel to a Schlegel closing combination, and found that it did a better job of closing up the seed trench. We found that cover crops what makes no-till work, because that is the tool that actually opens up the soil and makes clay work for no-till. Our first year we started with only half our corn acreage no-till, and most of the new ground was come out of sod. So we already had some structure because it'd been in sod for 6 to 7 years. And I think that helped us to be able to not see the yield drag that everybody said you'd have. Another practice is that we did split application of nitrogen at side dressing. And I feel that's what helped hold our yields. And we're going into our 6th year. And we're seeing yield increases, and it doesn't matter whether it's a wet year or a dry year. We're finding out that everything's balancing out a lot better because of the different reasons that have been spoken to. We did add, we do pop-up through the planter, as well as 2 years ago we added drizzle of nitrogen, because when we're growing cover crops, and 2 years ago we were rolling down 5-foot cover crop, we found that it was having a little drag on nitrogen at start, but before the season's out, the corn is pulling that material from the decaying cover crop. We found on a wet year 2 years ago, when we planted into green sod, which had a lot of forage, we did have a slug problem. Versus the cover crop of rye, even with 5 foot of material, we didn't see any slug damage. So there seems to be a difference there. Why no-till makes sense? Since doing no-till, we've seen our organic matter increase. Now, maybe it's because we sample better. I don't know, but we found that as the structure, we see the structure because if we have a wet fall, the equipment stays up on top. We don't make the ruts. When we have a large rain event, we can have a 3-inch rain event and the field just absorbs it. It's amazing. And then when we have a dry spell, we don't see the corn wilting. This past year, we had dry spells and the corn never saw that stress. Because we are based next to a mountain, we did get some showers that other parts of the county did not get, and that's why we saw phenomenal yields this past year. Another issue of replanting, that's gone away. In the 5 years that we've done it, we have not had to replant, whether it's a wet spring or a dry spring or any condition. One, because you don't get the puddling, as well as, if you do have a rain event, it disappears so much faster that you don't have any drowning in the fields. Spring, dry spring. Couple other, since we acquired the no-till corn planter, we've then put on a yield monitor on our chopper, so we're able to monitor throughout the field, and it records on our ag leader monitor, so we're able to follow yields throughout the whole process. We also use the yield monitor on a combine that we acquired, so we were able to track our soybean yields, and we're seeing more and more just how those type of tools work and are able to integrate, the whole system as a whole. This past year, we saw soybean yields on clay exceed between 70 and 90 bushel to the acre, which is unheard of for the New England. In the past, we've seen 40 bushel and thought we were doing a great job. So our whole farm average was just shy of 60 bushel. So even soybeans on clay was phenomenal. Of course, sunshine makes a difference. But I lay that to being no-till beans, just because the same thing happens with beans as it does with corn, is they don't have the stress. Even when you run into different periods of stressful situations, whether it's too wet, too cold, too dry, too hot. We've seen with the one-pass operation, huge savings in labor as well as equipment savings. Soil crusting is a thing of the past because we're not tilling the soil. We've seen, because we do some custom work, that the soil, by not being tilled, is actually softer to pull the planter through. We've seen that, and plus with the downforce, because that's constantly monitoring what you're doing, it takes less force to actually put seed in the ground. When we have a rain event, it doesn't matter what size of a rain event, we're able to return to planting sooner because the field hasn't been disturbed. Once again, water infiltration is much greater, and we've seen earthworm population just increasing, especially when we put down larger masses of cover crop. It just brings them out. They love it. And it's an interesting thing to see when you roll down 4 feet of rye and it's this massive mat, and you wonder, one, it helps with the weed suppression. Plus, by the end of the season, most all that material is gone. So you know that the organisms, they're just having a banquet. So therefore, because we had the concern of how we've always broadcasted and then incorporated. We didn't know how we're going to do that with all that massive material there, but it disappears enough so that it hasn't been an issue. Starting this year, because we've received money from a couple programs, we are acquiring a 30-foot Landell no-till drill so that we'll be able to do what we did on some of these test strips of doing multi-species, as well as getting it drilled in one pass so that we can get a larger biomass plus a better catch on our cover crops.
Can I ask you a question, George?
Ask me a question.
You mentioned, you talked about labor, but you talked about it quickly. Would you talk about how your labor has changed in the spring since you've made this change?
Well, we've gone from going from 3 to 4 people trying to get a corn crop into one person because it's a single pass.
There you go. So I think George is done, although I'm going to guess that we're going to have some folks who have questions. So I'm going to kick it to you, Catherine, maybe to facilitate that.
Sure. It doesn't look like we have any questions as of yet, but if anyone has anything to type in, you can feel free to do that on the chat or the Q&A. It looks like Rick wanted to add a point. He had typed, I also want to add that the other financial gain is the ability to harvest first cutting grass earlier due to reduced time needed for planting and prep. He said in late May, grass NDFD decreases by 1 unit per day, and this can have a huge impact on milk production and forage quality.
You want to talk at all about what that looks like for you, George, when you're trying to get first cut hay and corn planted, and if you've seen increased quality as a result, or at least less stress?
Oh, definitely, quality's up. Plus, another change we did is in our seedings, we used to try to fight to get that in the springtime. We've now gone to doing a summer seeding after we harvest our grain crop. And we've by putting our seedings in then, we get a better catch, less weeds, and then the following year, we're pulling off 3 cuttings off new seeding.
Great. And it looks like we just had 2 questions come in. So Diane was wondering, how does he terminate the cover crop?
For the most part, it's up till now, it's been with Roundup. And that's where we built our own crimper to go on the front of the corn planter, because when you get to anything over a foot, the Roundup terminates it, but it doesn't fall down. So then the corn has so much more of a struggle to get up over the dead canopy. But with the use of the crimper, the head of the corn planter, we're able to knock that down, and it's relieved that problem.
Great. And then
We were hoping to be able to do away without chemical on, especially when you have 4-foot rye. But we found we were still having some stuff come through. So we were having to make 1 application, but it's a lot less of a rate than what we were used to do when we did the tillage, especially with like velvet leaf and some of the real nasties.
All right, and then Dick Dale was wondering, are you applying any manure? If so, when do you apply it?
Yes, we're pretty much all dragline now, and we've been putting it on, though this last spring, we put it on after we have a debt. We can't put it on before April 1st. So we have to wait until after April 1st. The cover crops is already getting started, and we'll go on with anywhere from 4,000 to 7,000 gallons on the corn fields that we can reach with the dragline. Other fields, they receive, we have some stack sites that's applied before the corn goes on. And then this past year, we just tried the grassland injector, and we'll probably this coming spring use that as well, so that we can basically incorporate it very lightly. But we don't believe that we want to put a deep injection. We would just want to get it in on the surface.
All right, thank you, George. It looks like that's all the questions we have for now, but if any more questions come through or come to me after, I can forward them over to Kirsten and get them your way.
And if you want, Catherine, I can real quick show just a few more pictures since we've got a couple more minutes.
That'd be great.
George's farm. Can you guys, okay, so you can see my slides there?
Yes.
All right. So hang on, let me get the chat box out of the way. So this is Jeremy, I think, planting through some of our cover crop trials with their Kenzie no-till planter. This was before the roller crimper. Hang on, let's see. Okay, so that's it up close. He mentioned his Schlegel wheels, closing wheels. So those are these like finger-like looking closing wheels as opposed to a solid cast iron wheel. And they have them with the points faced out to put, I think, a little more pressure down. Is that right, George?
Yes. The bent part, the knuckles actually pushes in more.
Right. And then this is the roller crimper setup. So they have it mounted. It was a farm fabricated roller crimper. They mount on the front of the tractor. That's the same width as their no-till corn planter. And as you can see, as opposed to this setup, which actually that's pretty tame winter rye. It's not super tall. But it actually lays it down and plants it in the furrow. And the reason that became important, I should have made this picture bigger. This was corn that was planted into that tall rye that didn't get laid down. And you can see this was June 23rd, so a good month after planting, versus where we had tillage radish and it was winter kill and there wasn't all that residue. Plus there's a lot of nitrogen issues, like things going on here between like a high carbon and nitrogen ratio and a really low carbon and nitrogen ratio cover crop. But you can see the difference in the corn crop here. At the end of the year, we didn't have a difference in yield, but we did have a difference in how much nitrogen needed to be added at side dress time to this crop, and in the end it evened out. But, so I thought I would just share those pictures to describe what George had talked about.
Great, thanks again for the presentation to both of you.